This is a sort of statutorily required meeting, which is the first one we have after the election, in which the Board of Finance has to re-elect officers, even though none of us were up during that election. So as we've typically done in the past, I think what we're going to do is we'll run through from chair to vice chair to secretary, accept nominations, and vote on each one, and then move to the next position. So at this time, I'll open up the floor to nominations for chair.
Go ahead.
I nominate Jim Palin for chair.
Is there a second? Okay. Are there any other nominations? Okay. Hearing no other nominations, all those supporting Jim Palin as chair, say aye.
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 Aye. Okay. Thank you all. At this point, we'll open it up to nominations for vice chair. I'd actually like to start off and nominate Dan to serve again as vice chair.
Second.
Malin seconds. Any other nominations for vice chair? Okay, all those in favor of Dan Baumgartner serving again as vice chair? Unanimous. And at this point, I'll open up nominations for secretary.
I nominate Taylor Carter. Can we just do this by acclamation?
Yeah, I will second Taylor Carter, and I will tell you that I spoke to her today. And
Okay.
she did agree, although the phone was a little bit shaky, that she would accept if elected. So, any other nominations for secretary?
Second.
Oh,
Second for Taylor.
Jenny seconds. Any other nominations for secretary? Okay, all those in favor of Taylor Carter serving again as secretary? Unanimous. Okay. Next item on the agenda is public comment. Haven't received any emails. People regarding wanting to speak. Anyone in the audience want to speak to public comment? Okay, so we'll move on to our first action item, which are transfers. The first is to discuss and take action on a request to transfer $13,500 to the police professional services for promotional testing. And this is a transfer within the police department's existing budget.
Good evening, board. So this past September, we had a patrol sergeant that retired. So the police commission approved to refill that position. And as a department, we're contractually obligated to hire an outside agency to conduct our promotional testing for our officers. So we chose Badge Quest because they've been our vendor for the past 10 years. We have a great working relationship with them, and we like to continue to use them. The reason why I'm requesting this transfer is simply because this particular retirement was not projected when the budget was being put together last year. And due to current staffing shortages, we have some unspent full-time salaries in our patrol account that would cover these expenses. That pretty much sums it up. Open to any questions you may have.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
When was the last time that we used their services for this role?
We actually used it this past spring for our captain's promotional process.
That happened how frequently?
It really depends on the vacancies, retirements, and all that, but the lists are good for 2 years. So I wouldn't have to worry about something like this for next fiscal year.
Is there a different list for each level?
Correct.
So that's why you have to bring these guys in for.
Yep, exactly.
And then maybe it's more curious, I know we do have some vacancies and some of this is being transferred from full-time salary.
Yep.
Is there still sort of a bit of a net surplus in there versus any overtime that needed to be incurred to kind of make up for the shortfalls or the vacancies?
Yeah, I mean, as far as that account, yes, there are surplus in there. We are in the process right now of hiring several officers, 2 of which are going to be starting the academy in January. And then we're going to have 2 additional vacancies that we're working on right now and getting qualified candidates.
Okay. And with respect to like the cost for the academy,
Yep.
is that, can that be covered in the existing budget?
Yes, it can. We budget for that in our training budget. So we account for at least 3 trainees for academy expenses every year.
Got it.
So one final thing, so you have one opening basically for a sergeant?
For a sergeant, yes.
And 15 candidates is what you?
15 officers put in. Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
And are those all internal?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I accept the motion to transfer $13,500 from the police patrol full-time salary account to the police administration and professional services account.
Move.
Jenny Schwartz moves. Paul seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next item is to discuss and take action on a request to increase the Gorms Pond Dam repair appropriation and bonding authorization by $625,000.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Darren Ostafine. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Works for the town of Darien. We're here to request $625,000 extra dollars to the original appropriation due to a clerical error, a unit quantity that was not estimated correctly for the job. So I can go over what's written if you want me to, or rather, if you might have any questions, take those.
So I guess this project, I'll kick things off. This project right here, it's anticipated that we'll get 100% reimbursement from FEMA.
That is what we have been told by FEMA verbally.
Okay.
They will provide no written commitment to fund letters or any kind of documentation to that. But we've been told that. Another requirement of receiving FEMA funds is 100% reimbursement, and then after the project is over, a truing up of the expenses. But we continue to meet with them. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, and I completely understand what a difference that makes if we're getting reimbursed or not. But we're doing absolutely everything that we can to pursue 100% FEMA funding, FEMA reimbursement.
I have a question. The units are in square feet. However, all the other units in the bid are in cubic yards. Once again, are the units right?
We believe they are now. And you are correct. Interestingly that you point out cubic yards, because if it was in cubic yards, the unit, the number that's in there would be the correct quantity. So the fact that they use square feet instead of cubic yards, let me back up. You can measure things like this 3 different ways. One is cubic yard, which is a volume.
Yeah.
Another is square feet, which is a surface area.
Okay.
And yet a third way, which is even acceptable to FEMA, is a linear measurement. You could say there's 50 feet of wall, and we just accept that the wall is how high and how deep. So in this particular case, our consultant came up with the quantity in cubic yards, but he put it in the bid as square feet. Nothing wrong with either one of those, but they were not consistent with one another. It should have been a different number if you're going to use square feet, or if it was going to be, I believe 209 was the number in bid item number 14. If that was cubic yards, it would have been fine, but it wasn't, and that's where the disconnect happened.
Okay.
Do we review those bid instructions?
Do we review the bids? Yes.
Do the bid instructions,
The
bid request,
bid request.
because the bid request, didn't the
Oh,
bid
yeah,
request have
the bid
209
proposal.
square feet? Yes.
The bid proposal, did we review it? Yes.
Okay.
The error was on our side, our consultant, and
Okay.
we did not catch it.
Okay.
And the construction manager, is that a construction manager at risk proposal? Like construction companies sometimes will assume the risk of overages or mistakes and things of that nature with their insurance policy. It depends on how it's bid. Do you know if we bid that
No.
at risk or not?
The way you describe it, the answer is no. The contractor looked at this and said, hey, I think this number is a little light. So it was a project manager who really dug deep into the plans, and you can see there was a lot of bid items, and they really dug deep, and the construction project manager found it. The way the projects are structured, it's there's nothing like what you described. As a matter of fact, when this job is over, we're actually going to go out there and measure how many actual square feet there were. It might be a little more, a little less, it might be spot on. But whatever it is, that's what the contractor is going to get paid. He has a price per square foot. We'll be there and measure how many square feet. That's pretty much how
Okay.
all of our projects work.
Okay.
And then I guess my only question is, I know FEMA is very specific, but in terms of like this change, this doesn't require us to go back and rebid or do anything like that?
No. We have discussed it with the contractor. As a matter of fact, I believe we bid this way back in May, and it took us time to get the funding and go through the whole process. We spoke to the contractor throughout the process and let him know where we were and how much time it would take, because we can't hold the contractor there if he doesn't want to, right? So he could, if we don't award him the job within 30 days, he could say, hey, I can't do that job and I can't wait for you any longer. I'm going to go do other jobs. But from the beginning, we spoke with the contractor and he said, we have enough other work and we have enough people that we can move things around and we will wait for you. And when we finally got our funding in place and they put a project manager on it, he dug deep into the plans and started measuring everything, and he found this error in the quantity, and that's why I'm here.
Okay.
What exactly is it? Is it the stone, is it the mortar, or is it both?
Both.
Okay.
So that's what gets measured. If you have put a stone wall in at your house, if you could picture that,
Yes, I can.
you would pay, how big is the wall going to be? You pay more for a bigger wall,
Sure.
right? And
No.
it includes stone and mortar. Now the dam is going to be much
I didn't understand
bigger.
the way it was phrased
I'm
in the
sorry.
bid.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So so we're going to formally pass both a bonding resolution, an increase to the bonding resolution and an increase to the appropriation. So except somebody can move a resolution to amend the resolution adopted on September 23rd, 2024, appropriating $3,345,900 for costs to repair Gorham's Pond Dam and authorizing the issuance of bonds and notes in the amount of $3,345,900 to meet said appropriation, to increase the appropriation and bond order authorization by $625,000 to $3,970,900.
Move.
Jenny moves. Glenn seconds. All those in favor? Okay, unanimous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, next thing is to discuss and take action on our proposed 2025 meeting calendar.
For the most part, it follows the same schedule we've used in the last couple of years. We avoid school breaks, we avoid Jewish holidays, except Hanukkah, because that is difficult to avoid in December. And we avoid Juneteenth, which doesn't fall on a Tuesday this year. We have scheduled 3 budget work sessions and then the final vote on April 8th. We must vote by the 3rd Tuesday in April for the charter. And then the only other required meetings are March 4th and March 11th. Those are also dictated by the charter for receiving the budgets and for holding a public hearing. And then we once again had a snow date or inclement weather date the following week for the public hearing, which would be March 18th. So if we meet on the 11th, we would not meet on the 18th.
So Jen, my only question on that, on the 11th and the 18th is, would we keep the 18th as a meeting even if we didn't have to have the rain date for the statutory
I
meeting?
mean, if we have the hearing on the 11th and then you still wanted to meet on the 18th?
Yeah, I guess I just open up that, should we at least reserve that for a regular meeting? Just given it's in the thick of the budget season, or?
I think in the past, haven't we not had a regular meeting after the statutory meeting? We just had a regular meeting on that third Tuesday? Because I don't remember going from a statutory hearing.
That's what we used to do, and then last year, I think we changed it because people said if we have to be here for a public
Yeah.
hearing anyway, which can be
Yeah.
very brief, let's actually have a regular
You
meeting.
met right after last
We
year.
did? Oh.
Pretty sure,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I guess my only question would be, just given, should we keep that on, in there as just have the rain date be for the public hearing, and then have that meeting as well?
You certainly can,
And
and
then
then
we can always-
if you find that you don't need it, you can always cancel it.
Yeah. I feel like it's just better to have it warned as a regular meeting, then we have like 30 days. And Jen, remind me, what is the last possible date that we have to pass the budget by?
We have to turn it over to the town clerk the third Tuesday in April.
Be the 15th.
Is it?
21st?
So basically,
It's actually the 15th, because April 1st is a Tuesday, so it's very early this year.
April Fools.
So right now, you're scheduled to vote 1 week before that, and I didn't print the copy that had my dates, but I think school vacation is the week of April 13th.
Yeah, it's April 14th through 18th.
Yeah, so we definitely want to wrap it up before then, anyway.
Otherwise, we'd have to push school vacation.
I mean, you do what you gotta do.
Okay. Well, any comments on calendar? We're good. Dan, I won't be here on the 14th of January, so I probably need you to
Okay.
fill in for that. Okay. I will accept the motion to accept the our 2025 calendar as laid out.
You want to do it as amended?
Oh, sorry, as amended, having a regular meeting occur on the 18th of March, regardless of whether or not we have to have the snow date for a statutory hearing.
So moved.
Paul moves. Dan seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous. Okay, the next item is to discuss fiscal '26 budget and guidance. I sent you guys all around some work that I had done with the help of Jen and the help of a few of the other of you, to try to begin to think about what this budget could look like based on certain things that we know and certain things that we don't know. So what I was going to do is put up a few pages here that I prepared, some of which will probably make it into my state of the town.
What's the date of the state of the town? Do you know that offhand?
The 9th.
12/9?
So, this is the first page that I always use in the presentation when I, a couple times each year, I teach a class at a high school about law and government. And this one that I always use to kind of kick off the presentation, and you guys have seen it in my State of the Town address, which are, at least in my view, are kind of how we need to think about running and financing Darien, right? I think it's, there are a number of things that make, I think, the town great. But I think it's really the fact that we have all of them and we check all the boxes and we check them so well that actually makes this a place that people want to continue to live in, move to, and others continue to move here from all over. So obviously our schools, they occupy like 75% of our operating expenses. They're, at or among the very best in the state, if not the region. I think when you look at our home values, as we talked about in our latest reassessment that we had last year, houses on average are up about 25% over 5 years. I think I heard a report, I think maybe it was at the Board of Selectmen's meeting, talking about the fact that I think we have the lowest inventory of houses on the market that we've had in any recent time. I think, there's a slide I put together here when we talk about our taxes, both absolutely and as a mill rate. The taxes that residents pay here in Darien are among the lowest in the entire state of all 169 different towns. I think nearby, it's really only Greenwich that has a lower mill rate than we do. I think parks and beaches, when you look at our outdoor space, which when I look in sort of how people rank things, and I would always say they put schools at the top, I think parks and beaches and our outdoor space have moved up significantly in that list. And I think it's, probably a number 2 or number 3 right now. And I think if you look at the money that we've put into Highland Farms recently, Great Island and so forth, I think we've continued to invest in that. I think when you look at our public services, whether it's our police, whether it's our parks, our public works, whether it's our volunteer fire departments, our volunteer EMS services, I think we have, the best we could ask for. And then geography, while we can't influence it, I think we do sit right at the right precipice of being close to New York City and all that has to offer, but to being far enough away where you can have a backyard and kind of feel like you're part of a small town here. So I think all of those things fit well. I think it's important that we, as we begin to think about how we spend our money and our resources, that we continue to sort of allocate them, across all 5 of these priorities, even though we can't change our geography. So at least the kids in the class generally react very well to that. In terms of things that, this is a modified discussion of one of the slides I always include on the State of the Town, kind of talking about what we should be thinking about during the budget process. And I'd like to make this sort of be interactive. So if there are things that you all think I should maybe incorporate into this slide as I talk about it at the State of the Town, and we use it to talk with other boards, I mean, let's make this be an active discussion. The budget, what always first comes to mind are the numbers, right? What are the amount of the budgets? How much are we appropriating? What is it doing to taxes? That's certainly, I think, one of the important things. We need to figure out how do we balance taxes and keeping this to be a great sort of financial opportunity for people to move here and live here, and services, how we spend money to make sure that we're spending them on the right services, the right level and quantity of services that people want to move here. I think it's a combination of those two that, at least in the 22 years that I've lived here, have made this be such a great place. Moving beyond just the numbers, i.e. what is the tax rate and what are the budgets that our operating partners are going to put in front of us. I look at, and this is like my 19th year here following budgets, but I look very closely at how the budgets are developed, how the operating boards, the library, the Board of Ed, the Board of Selectmen, also all of their department heads and so forth. I think I follow very closely sort of how they discuss it. And I think it's important that, like during those discussions that that we always see them, or listen to them, I should say, and see them, talk about how they're spending money. What are their priorities for the upcoming year? What's changed versus last year? Rethinking the programs that they're delivering. Should they be delivering them, more of them, less of them? Structuring them differently, whether this is on the library side, town side, school side, or any of the departments inside of there. But I think how the boards spend, their kind of 4 to 6 weeks going through those budgets, I think it's important for us to watch and sort of learn and understand where their priorities are. Because I think in a town where I think we can all say there are sort of infinite wants, right? I mean, even Darien has sort of finite resources, and I think we need to make sure we understand how our operating boards are responsible for education and town services, right? Where they view the priorities to be and how they want to spend those resources. Efficiency. I think, times are constantly changing. The cost of our inputs are constantly changing, whether that be staff, whether it be technology, equipment, outsourcing. I think it's very important as our operating boards continue to go through and build their budgets, that they need to constantly be looking at and reevaluating how they're sort of putting together and delivering their overall services to look for efficiencies. That can be taking 1 + 1 and creating 3, or that can be determining how to fund a certain thing at a lower price. That can include shared resources. That can include things like our probate court sharing it with New Canaan. I think really the sky should be the limit in terms of looking at ways to most efficiently use all of our resources and deliver the services. And I think the last topic I kind of call transparency and planning, right? I think the budget process, which lasts a couple short months, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think it's important that our boards and we sort of plan for that process. Use the 8 to 10 months when things are a little bit quieter to think about different policies, think about different types of operational changes, do the work that's sort of necessary to be able to make decisions based on those, and then either incorporate them into or not incorporate them into the budgets or make changes, right? I think the second bullet point I'll make here is I think it's a better process when we can move more of our expenditures, whether they be on the capital side or on the operating side, bring them all forward during the budget process, whether that's fire trucks, whether that's school buses, security. I think the better job we can do bringing and planning all of those things outside of emergencies to come in front of us at the same time, we can look at and better utilize and optimize all the variables that we're going to talk about in the spreadsheet I shared with you guys. We can decide, as we did last year, for example, like with the Board of Ed, had some equipment and the fire trucks, we can decide at the last minute to kind of take them out and fund them slightly differently, bonding, move them around. But I think it's important to have them all be on the table when we're making one spending decision.
The only modification I make on this page, Jim, is in the top bullet. Our responsibility include determining the overall level of taxation that our residents will bear. That's a mathematical calculation, but I would modify that to say should bear, which is what's the tax burden we believe our residents should shoulder to fund what's on your first page, the parks and the schools and the services and et cetera. So, and that's a tricky thing, and that involves judgment more than it does math, but that's our responsibility, is to exercise that judgment.
And it's a good point. I mean, 90% of our tax revenue comes from residential taxpayers, right? That's 90% of our grant list, right? And if you include things like automobiles and so forth that are primarily owned by them and or small businesses, it's beyond that. So it's, no doubt, we can raise whatever taxes we need because we pass a mill rate and we push that on at least to our partners at the RTM, who then either approve or adjust that. So we can kind of raise whatever we want by just setting a mill rate or even passing out incremental mill rates during the year. But it's really incumbent on us to try to think, like, what is the right appropriate level of spending. And I think it's important, Dan, that brings up a good point. I mean, when you look at our town, I mean, Darien gets accolades and it's known as a very sort of, lucky, successful, wealthy, asset-intensive town. But Darien itself is diverse. When you look at you dig deeper down in our budgets and you look at things such as our social services, when you look at sort of the high variance in home values and so forth, and the fact that, we've got a third of our households have school-aged kids, which are part of our 5,000 student school system, but there's also a lot of retired folks that are living on fixed incomes, and it's important to kind of balance the taxpayers at all ends of the spectrum.
The second paragraph, the first word should be the.
You didn't like the?
Well, either that or make it 3 because you have 3 bullets after it.
Yeah. And, on development and review process, I mean, I think in the last handful of State of the Town presentations, I've talked about the fact of trying to, keep the very intensive sort of policy decisions, get those done before the budget season, so that they can be implemented during the budget season, and and not sort of distract focus away from what is a very important kind of 4, 5, 6 weeks. So I think, one of our challenges from this seat, I think we're really the intersection between the wants and needs and requests of our operating boards, who actually run the schools and run the towns, or oversee, I should say, the staff that run the schools and the towns. Balancing that with the taxpayer. And what I was trying to get across on this slide right here is, ultimately our operating boards, they're the ones that sort of ultimately drive taxation through the budget requests. But they come to us, and to Dan's earlier point, we're the ones that have to balance, and not always a mathematical kind of black and white manner. How do we take those sort of wants and needs and balance it into the appropriate taxation and appropriation structure that'll work for our residents, and where they'll see value and sort of what they're being delivered, if you will, through our services, with what they're being asked to sort of fund through taxes. And when I think about either of those decisions, how you sort of manage spending with taxes and then taxes supporting our spending, I think it's really incumbent upon our operating boards, but also us to be aware, what is the quality and quantity of services that our residents want. And I think those type of questions really come into play when you're making decisions around, Great Island as an example. That was a massive and transformational purchase, right? That expanded our outdoor space from 200 plus acres to close to 300 acres, right? I think things like making the determination to completely tear down and rebuild, Oxridge into what is probably one of the best elementary schools in the state, if not the broader region. Those are big decisions where inherently we're trying to measure what we spend to kind of match what our residents and what our constituents want. And I think on the same way with HHR, I think we did a good job, and I think the schools and the building committee trying to find the right medium there. We could have just tore all 3 of them down and completely started from scratch Jill's probably gonna pull her hair out now, but I think what we did was we, through a lot of sort of research on, at the building committee and all of our boards, a lot of discussion, we kind of found that right place. We found a $100 million project to massively renovate 3 schools and get us the next 15, 20, 25 years. And I think that's the balance. And it takes a lot of work, I think a lot of partnership to sort of determine how you match those two. And then on the other side of the equation, on the right side, determining like what is our right long-term strategy? Do we want to be the lowest mill rate in the state of Connecticut? Or even compared to like Westchester and as you get into Long Island and southern Massachusetts, right? Where do we want to be as you think about like in our schools? Do we want to be the number one? Where do we think our spending should be relative to other schools, right? Where do we think the amount of parkland that we have per acre, right, or per resident, where do we think that should be relative to like New Canaan? Because we're never going to kind of catch up with some of our surrounding towns. But I think those are very important, I think, decisions we need to make. I think we need, obviously, when we're making the spending decisions like we did during COVID, we need to take into account kind of what's happening in the broader economic environment. And I think we and the operating boards all made some very hard decisions in that March and April of 2020 to take a much more conservative view on taxation and what we're going to spend. And I think all the boards successfully sort of pulled back. We saved. I think everyone pretty much returned surpluses and so forth. And luckily, relatively quickly, we kind of came out of that, I think, and we're in great shape. And then I think, it is a little bit of a competitive environment. I think we do want to keep Darien. We want it to be the place where people choose to move. When they're looking at surrounding Fairfield County, I think we want to have the best sort of value proposition. What are people getting for their home value, for their taxes? What's the type of schools that their kids can attend, the public services, police, fire, everything that we offer? It's a difficult circle, and it's one that I think requires constant attention and sort of challenging ourselves.
And it doesn't lend itself to a mathematical formula. It lends itself to collective judgment of the responsible boards in town.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of numbers that you can use to try to measure some of this stuff, but ultimately it's a qualitative issue. On the next page here, John, JC had started off talking about sort of core and growth probably 5 or 6 years ago in one of his State of the Town addresses. And we always sort of looked at core as being what we did last year. Let's call it kind of ceteris paribus on the quantity side and services side, adjusted for the prices of those services and those inputs. And then we had growth, which were sort of, expanding the quantity or bringing, new services on. I thought a little bit about what that meant and whether we were missing something by simply breaking stuff into, core and growth in that manner. And what I tried to do on this page here, and you guys can tell me if I was successful or not, but rethink sort of what core is, right? In terms of how we fund the services that our 2 big boards, ultimately deliver to our residents, right? When I think about core, I'm thinking about sort of basic services, right? Things that the state and our national government kind of mandate that we do. Safety, well-being, right? Being able to sort of attract and retain staff to kind of meet all of our basic services, right? I think whether you're talking about, I break our operating budgets up, just because how they are overseen between like library, schools, and town, right? So basic services can mean different things to each of those, right? You might think about the town, I think about basic services being, sort of fire, ambulance, police, keeping the sewers, keeping the roads moving, those type of kind of core services, right? Like those are things that we absolutely sort of need to have, right? When you think about sort of in the schools, we have, you know, the basic subjects with transportation, we have all the different types of services we're required to offer, right? Safety, security, and so forth, right? And then when you go outside of what's core and absolutely required, which Darien does regularly, we do more than just the absolute minimum. You begin to think about, well, what are things that are not core, not required? And required, I don't think always means core, right? But what are things that we here in Darien put a very high priority on, right? And as you break out in these concentric circles, you kind of, I think everybody agrees on what core is. As you get into things that are higher priorities, you begin to have differences of opinions of what things people value more than others, right? You know, think about, you know, fully staffed police boats, think about sports, think about extra activities at the library, all of these other things that we know, you know, a large portion of our population value here in town, but we wouldn't necessarily say they're core things that we need to have. And again, I say like core, non-core, and Darien sometimes becomes a little bit fuzzy, right? But I view these are things that are, while they may not be core, it's a very high return on our investment. We have massive participation or massive sort of output with very little extra.
To your point, you mentioned some of those non-core items. I think you should put them on the slide instead of just, you know, fireworks, nice to have, not a core item. 2 or 3 under each one of them,
Some
so people
examples.
understand what you mean.
Yeah.
The other thing is there's a judgment because core, talk about paving roads, but that's a core service, but you don't always have to do it as often as maybe you did it one year. So, I mean, so I think as long as that word doesn't mean you don't revisit what you do every year and say, is this a year that we need to keep doing it as we always do it, or is this year we need to do something differently?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there's one thing to maintain our roads, right? But I think when you think about that, I think about quality and quantity of service. Are we repaving every, I don't know the exact cadence, but are we repaving every 10 years, every 15 years, right? And are we, you know, how often are we replacing sidewalks? But I think that's, you know, even within core, the frequency and the quality of those services.
It's the can it wait? Can this wait?
Yeah.
Or change,
Mm-hmm.
like, you
Right.
know, change exactly how that core service is being done.
Yep. I think when I think about some of the high priority ones, these are things that, again, may not be core, but there's widespread support for it in the community. And so while it might not be defined as core, you know, everyone supports it and expects it, right? And then it becomes contingent on like the operating boards to determine, well, how do some of these high priority things interact with things that are absolutely core to what we do, right? And that's not necessarily our decision or our job to kind of make those decisions, but I think we need to listen to how those decisions are made as we think about the levels that we fund these.
But to Melin's point, if we decide, the town decides that a service is high priority, that doesn't mean we shouldn't evaluate the way we're delivering that service to make sure it's as efficient, high value, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not suggesting everything needs to go to like a zero-based budgeting approach, but a mindset of if we're doing this as a way to deliver it differently, that's more efficient from a financial perspective.
And then the other is, as you go into the outside circle, which I said were like low priority and not core. These are things that I sometimes think about are like they're unique, they're transformative, right? They sort of put Darien on the map, if you will, but they're not, whether it's Great Island, whether it's robotics, whether it's, you know, the police drone, like all of these things that may not be absolutely necessary, but here it's unique. We have sometimes We have we might have some of it privately funded, so it dramatically lowers the cost and increases the return on the investment. But it's, as you get into that outer circle, that's where I think the challenge here is to constantly be thinking about how fast are we growing the outside circle in years where the inside circle is growing very quickly. And so, if I could make this sort of time dimensional, that what I would show is throughout different budget cycles, there are some cycles where we saw our core expenses growing very quickly. And as those grow very quickly, if you assume the outside circle is somewhat constrained by the overall taxes that the 7 of us are going to approve or recommend that the RTM approve, if that overall circle is fixed, how large are the inner circles swelling such that the core maybe crowds out a little bit of the non-core high priority, or the non-core high priority crowds out the non-core low priority? So I would have that swelling in and out if I could figure out how to do that on a...
Right, the circle just doesn't keep getting bigger.
Right,
Yeah.
instead of the pie just getting bigger.
Yeah, pie doesn't get
Yes.
bigger.
Right.
And I think that's the challenge, because the prices of different inputs, different priorities and so forth, these aren't static views. And these are why, we have 2 operating boards that oversee their staff and ultimately make those decisions year after year. How are we allocating funds in the inner circle, the middle circle, and the total circle?
So one thing I do want to clarify here is that, yes, the costs of providing the core and close to core services, there's pressure of those to go up, but it's not correlated with inflation. The 5 components, the 5 largest components of inflation are shelter, food, energy, new vehicles, and used vehicles. Now, we pay for vehicles in our capital budget, but not in our operating budget. So the only one of those 5 that impacts our operating budget is energy. And that's gasoline, heating fuel, that kind of thing. So there are pressure on costs to go up, but it's not CPI. It's not 6% CPI increase, has very little impact on these budgets other than through energy. And so I just want to make sure, I'm not saying there isn't price pressure or cost pressure. I'm just saying it's not what we commonly refer to as inflationary.
Yeah. So here, I think I shared this with some of you all a couple weeks ago, but I went and looked at over the last 10 years what the mill rate has been in the sort of 8, what I kind of call comparative towns here in Fairfield County. For those of you guys in the back, Darien is the blue line, that's second from the bottom, and Greenwich is the orange line on the very bottom, Wilton's on the top, right? You can see some of the sharp movements if you look on the far right-hand side of the graph, where our blue line dipped somewhat precipitously last year. That's because of the revaluation. And I have behind this, I'm not sure if I sent it to you guys, a big spreadsheet that sort of outlines which of those points was a revaluation year, which normally doesn't have that large of an effect because our house is not going up by 25% in such a short period of time. But I think this is an example here. I think when you look at where we are, again, this is just the mill rate, right? It doesn't show the actual household taxation and so forth, because the mill rate simply applied to the value of the house. But if you, for example, if you look at us in New Canaan, 2 similar towns, right? Similar population sizes, I think somewhat similar school sizes and so forth. If you were to, and I'm missing a little bit of the data from some of the other towns, so this is like a working session, but if you looked at what the average taxpayer in Darien pays, so our mill rate applied to our average home value, and compared that to New Canaan, of what the average home value is compared to their mill rate, you would see we're about 10% higher. And so when I look at that, I think should the average household in Darien pay about 10% more in taxes than the average household in New Canaan? And there's a lot of statistics behind that. So there are a lot of assumptions we can kind of go through, but just directionally, you know, I sit back and, you know, I say we're 4 or 5, we border each other. We generally compete with similar labor pools, which is 70% of our overall cost and so forth. We have similar numbers of schools and, you know, other types of services that we deliver, right? But we're different from a dollar perspective.
And that's even though their mill rate's higher.
Yeah, their mill rate's higher, but their average home value, which there's a lot of different ways you measure that, because all of our town assessors report stuff in their like annual summaries a little bit differently than the other one. So it's one of the things I'm talking to Anthony and Millie about, trying to make sure it's as apples to apples as possible, but we're definitely a little bit higher than, kind of depending on how you measure it, it's 5 to 10%. But this is just meant to give you an idea kind of where we sit, you know, competitively. So what I put together here was, I went back and recreated the last few years worth of budgets and broke them down into the different sections, looked at what some of the trends were in all of those different sections, and then looked at where I think we're starting fiscal year 2026. And the way that I did that was I first looked at our grand list, which our grand list is about 11.2 billion directionally. Last year was about 11.1. And so I assumed that this year our grand list would go up by about 1%. And if you guys look on the top of that page here, you can see over the past 4 or 5 years, you know, that's gone up from, and I have more data kind of going back, but it's been from like 75 basis points or up to as much as 2%. Some of the bigger grand list years were a result of some of these large projects at Riverton Heights or Corbin and some of the other ones kind of coming on board, which, you know, when I think about grand list growth, it's, you know, there's really 2 forms of growth. There's what I call like real growth, where the grand list is growing and there's more taxpayers being brought into the system. And I use like Riverton Heights as one of those examples, right? We're taking a parking lot or a fairly like underutilized building, moving it up a bunch of stories and adding 10 or 15, you know, families or individuals there, 10 or 15 new sets of taxpayers. That's what I call like real, true grand list growth, right? If Malin redoes her bathroom, right, and files a permit with the town hall, and ultimately she gets assessed a little bit higher, well then I just have a couple dollars going from my taxes to your taxes. That's what I call sort of tax shifting, right? We're not bringing anyone new into town. We're just sort of shifting back and forth based on people's relative values of their homes and kind of, you know, small improvements that they may have made. So for this purposes right here, what I've assumed is that the grand list growth that we'll see on the grand list that I guess Jen, Tony should finish up in the next, you know, soon, right?
Gets finalized January 31st.
Okay, and then is that after the changes? To
No, the BAA meets after that.
Yeah, so we have, you know, that's a bit of a process to go through, but I'm assuming for this, it's gonna increase by 1%. Our collection rate, like the last couple of years, was 99.48%. I moved it up to 99.5%. Because I think we've continued to see, you know, extremely high collection rates. You know, so this is more of a budgeting and timing assumption. Our debt service, right? Our debt service is going up by about 10%, right? It's going up because Oxbridge is now amortizing principal. It's going up because we are going to be rolling we rolled sort of half the cost of Great Island through a couple different one-year bans, and now that's going to be termed out in terms of 30-year debt, so we'll be paying interest. This assumes that when we issue those bonds, I think we're at tad under 4%,
Yeah.
and we assume that we don't pay principal in the first 2 years, like we have in recent. That kind of layers it in nicely into our debt schedule here. We're assuming that we issue $44 million worth of new bans, about 40 of which will cover sort of the next portion of HHR, and 4 or 5 million for another handful of smaller projects in town. So that's all sort of baked into what's driving debt service up. Last year, just FYI, you can see, I think on the bottom of this right here, you can see that debt service was actually down 2.5% versus the prior year. And then when I look at investment earnings, right, we had, if I pull together what we earn in the general fund, which is our largest kind of pot of cash, right, as well as what we earn in our reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenditures and some of the stuff that the treasurer manages, bond proceeds and so forth, the quantity of funds we have will remain relatively constant because we're going to replenish it with some new HHR funds. But we're already a few cuts into the Fed's actions, and we're probably going to see a few more over the next few quarters here. So what I've assumed is that investment earnings, primarily driven by the investment rate, come down by 20%. So while I show investment earnings there at 2.7 million, what that really is that's down from 3.4 million the prior year. So it's a flat 20% haircut. I can guarantee it's going to be wrong because it'll be higher or lower than that, but that's just an assumption, right? To make sure, at least as we go into these analyses here, we're recognizing that we're going to have less investment earnings than we had last year. Still way more than what we've had historically, but less. So then taking those 4 assumptions right there, as well as some other stuff you guys see in the paper right here, I looked at what are the other 2 things that ultimately affect the tax rate that we deliver to our to our constituents. The first is like the use of our general fund. Last year, directionally, we had around 6 million more than what we needed under our sort of 15% Board of Finance guidance and the sort of new Moody's target that has, that we're now sort of operating under as well. We had 6 million last year. We used about 3 million to reduce the mill rate last year. About 1.7 of it was actually used inside the budget. The other 1.3 was used for, I think, a combination of school buses, and we had some security appropriations, which really got into that $3 million number. So post the budget, a lot of the discussions we had here were we were generally going to try to use half of it last year and half of it this year. So on the left-hand side of these matrices, one of the variables we have is how much money do we want to use from our rainy day fund to help offset the tax increase on behalf of our residents. Now keep in mind, once we use it up, it's not available for future years. The second thing
Well,
is...
the other thing is, just on that point, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we would prefer not to use even that excess to fund operating losses.
Correct.
That's a bad habit that rating agencies and actually just common sense, suggest that we shouldn't do that. Which is not to say we can't do a little bit of it, and that's not to say that if we have a surplus from the outgoing fiscal year that we can kind of apply that. But just to say we're going to use 3 million, that money we've historically used that money for capital, but not we've tried not to fund operating losses excessively.
Correct. Yeah, I think we've
So
only...
nor should we.
Yeah, we've only used
Right.
money in there to fund capital and/or off-cycle unexpected appropriations. Like if you think
So
about
this
the
should not be
COVID.
considered a rainy day fund to subsidize a tough operating budget. That's a dangerous way of thinking about it.
Exactly. So you'll see on the left-hand side, I've shaded in green 1.5 to 2.5 million. which is, in my view, where I think generally we're gonna be. What could make that be larger? Investment earnings trending above what we expected, and generally the Fed's easing has been a little bit slower than what most people have expected originally, so that's helping promote some more. You know, each year, you know, or I should say in most years, the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen have kind of returned some surplus back to the general fund. So if that surplus comes in high, and this $1 million surplus that goes back in, that could push us to the upper side of this band, or it could cause this band to slide up, right? Other appropriations that we have, you know, coming in front of us, like the dam is expected to be reimbursed by FEMA and so forth, but other appropriations that come forward over the next 2, 3, 4 months that we might not expect could use up some of that money that we have available, right? And then, you know, keep in mind, given that this general fund balance is going to grow as our budgets grow, if we use it all, then we're just going to need to, you know, we may have to tax in future years to be able to keep it at our target balance. So that's why I think we want to, you kind of want like a soft landing onto your target. So anyway, that's why I was in the 1.5 to 2.5 range, and it could be moved up or down based on, you know, what we learn over the next 3 or 4 months. So that's one variable. The second, across the top column, where it starts at 1% on the left and goes to 6% on the right, that's our increase in operating and capital expenses for Board of Ed, Library, and Board of Selectmen. Now, listen, Library falls inside of the Board of Selectmen, but you know, it does sort of operate somewhat independently and so forth, and so that, you know, we look at all of those. So the way you should read this graph here is, if on average, all 3 of those operating entities come in with a 3.5% operating increase, and we were to use $2 million from our general fund, the tax levy, which is defined as the total of dollars that we collect from all of our residents, and that flows into the tax collector's office, would increase by 4.33%. Now, because what we talked about on the grand list, because that's growing by 1%, that generally is it by 1%. So if you move to the bottom chart right here, you can see a 3.5% operating and capital expense increase, and a $2 million contribution lead to a 3.28% mill rate increase. So, you know, again, the more real growth that we have in our grand list, the more at least I personally focus a little bit more on mill rate growth, the more, you know, just basically shifting, you know, kitchens and pools and bathrooms, if you will. I look more at the overall tax levy on the top. So, you know, to kind of kick off the conversation here, the green box in the middle, when I think about what is the increase I want to see in the overall tax levy, taking into account everything that I know now, or the increase in the mill rate on the bottom, if you look inside those, that square of 9 numbers, is where I would like to sort of end up, and like to encourage our boards to all work to get towards. So, you know, again, we're going to learn a lot more about what's going on with our general fund. We're going to learn a lot more about the budgets as they're presented to us. We'll learn more about the grand list in the back half of January. We'll have better ideas as we get our budgets around investment earnings, where rates are, timing of our bond deal. We'll know if our assumption of kind of high 3% level on our 30-year debt is high or low. All of these things will constantly update this, and to be at that same type of target increase, if things come in better than expected, it could slide the amount of operating expense increases that we could withstand to the right. It could also slide it to the left. So there's, you know, many gigabytes of sort of data and assumptions and everything behind it I've shared with you guys. But this is, you know, what we're looking at now based on, you know, the limited number of assumptions that we can begin to nail down.
So can you talk about, Jim, why 3.5% to 5% in the tax levy sensitivity case? You're at 3.5% to 5% in the overall growth of the levy, right?
Yep.
So at a 3% operating budget increase at 2.5 million, that's 3.5%, and then that could go up to 5.1% at 1.5 contribution and a 4% operating budget. But what informs that that's your target? 3.5 to 5 on one level, and then 2.5 to 4 on the mill rate growth.
Correct. Basically, if the operating budgets go up by 3% and we fund 2 million, then mathematically, the formula determines you need 3.86%
Right.
growth in your tax levy. What I looked at, if you look at this sheet here, like, 4 or 5 rows down here, you can see look at the total property taxes collected.
You're on the spreadsheet.
Yeah, so you can see over, last year is 4.3%, before that 3.3, 4.3, 4.4. So it's generally circled like around 4% in terms of the tax levy growth. Now, each year we've been contributing from from the general fund to kind of help keep that down. We've also, if you look back over, I think we're probably going on, Jack will correct me, maybe 5 or 6 years now that we've made decisions to bond fire trucks. So bonding the fire trucks, which means we're not kind of taxing for them today, we're taxing for them in the future. We were doing it at ultra low rates that were sort of in the 1.5% to 2.5% range. Now we're sort of in the 3.5% to 4% range and so forth. There were a lot of things sort of moving on that all allowed us to do that, right? But when I look at sort of what I expect or what I'd like to see going forward, and frankly, what do our residents? 'Cause I think if there's one thing our residents like is consistency. Consistency of taxes, consistency of services. So that's kind of how I got to that area there, that green shaded box.
I think, just to answer my own question, the way I think about it is we basically have 70% of our budgets in contracted wages across all the boards. So if we didn't add any people, but we didn't subtract any people, we would be at 3% plus or minus. Some contracts are a little bit differently, but call it 3%. And then we have other things like healthcare that are growing at higher than 3%. So that gets me to kind of that 4%-ish range, because those things are growing more than 3%. But the challenge is all the other services to deliver those within that growth rate. And that's where a lot of the tough decisions are made, right? So, because new services that may be very popular add to that core 3 to 4% and turn up a 3 to 4% budget into a 4 to 5 or a 5 to 6 or a 6 to 7% budget.
And I think, Dan, what that highlights, I feel like is a little bit of this. As you see different, certainly things like our, being able to hire and retain good staff is what I would say a core part of what we need to build into our budgets, right? And obviously the healthcare is an absolute must in terms of being able to, and other sort of employee benefits to be able to hire and retain them, right? So as core sort of gets larger, if you're trying to constrain the overall circle, then it's all about how you're mixing sort of the medium blue and light blue.
I think what this analysis illustrates is if we were to pass 6% increase in budgets, that would, given these assumptions, that would yield a 5 to 6% increase in the tax bills to our residents. And that's where some might think that that's okay and some might think that that's too high. And that's the discussion we'll have in March and April.
Well, and then it compounds, right? So it's not just this one year you're gonna get it. In an extreme case, a 6.5% increase, because it's usually what's getting added is compounding. It's not one and done. You're
Right.
never reverting back, right, to a much lower budget. It's usually because you're adding, we know what the cost of adding FTEs is. It's a compounding effect. So keeping the pie from, it's going to grow, but constraining or watching how much it should grow, and then like your circles, how much those circles are changing and growing within, it's a budget constraint. So I think this is really helpful. Thank you for
Agreed.
putting this together.
Right.
And I like that it's, your green area is sort of right in the middle, right? I don't, our excess fund balance is generous, but not at the growth rate of our budget the last couple of years, right? So we're going to be growing into that excess fund balance. If the fund balance doesn't change much, but our budgets continue to grow, soon it's not going to be such a big excess. So,
Right. Yeah. Or the rating agencies hit us with
Yeah.
an adjustment, all of a sudden,
right.
we don't have $2 million.
You don't have
for
it,
Pete,
so-
the excess is a calculation based on the total budget. So if the total budget, if the fund stays the same and the total budget goes up, then the excess shrinks, just as a mathematical calculation.
So, and then I think, I know that there was a discussion about, I know the Board of Selectmen's looking at off-cycle, a process for evaluating off-cycle, because last year we had some off-cycle capital. Well, that, you only have a couple, if you get those again, that's it for, you wipe out your excess fund balance. So managing those, can't have too many of those, or at least need to really understand why they come.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to the budget process, when I talk about sort of, like, everything kind of really needs to be on the table. If there's something that's going to come, I think that, like, the threshold for bringing something off cycle should be, setting aside like emergencies, should be very high, because it's causing us to make, as a town and as a board, sort of an off-cycle decision, not knowing what's coming the next year, how we need to plan, because we're generally trying to plan year to year.
Well, it goes back to the discussion we had about a certain town building, about how they didn't plan out their repairs or schedule them or know when they were to come. If everybody in town lays everything on the table for the next 5, maybe 10 years, at least we have a chance to look at everything and prioritize.
Listen, and one thing, which I'll hopefully have here soon, Jay-Z and myself and Jen's been helping, and a few of you have kind of helped getting me more information. I think we're pretty darn close to having what I'm going to call like an appropriation and capital project tracker. So we'll know all of the active things that are floating around, that are out there, and Gorham's Pond Bridge is one of them. Now, in this case, we had a cost increase that should be covered by FEMA, but we should know all the projects that are out there, whether there's some of the flooding projects, which I think are being, I think there's a meeting on Thursday night or next Thursday, right? A number of them out there, how they're being funded, bonding and so forth, because all of that's going to determine if all of a sudden our capital projects between 4 schools and the police station and everything start growing too quick fast, we're going to need to kind of manage our operating expenses a little bit. And so this will hopefully begin to give us a look, Paul, in terms of this is how much we're going to need to pay cash for in the next 4 or 5 years. This is how much we're going to be able to bond for, and what will the layering on of that bond debt service and principal look like. I think allow us to look further into the future so we can plan, and so our operating boards can kind of plan around it.
The other thing we can do is in tough operating years, we can defer some of that capital that isn't necessary. It's a nice to have, not a need to have, so that we're not putting too much pressure on the overall tax levy in a given fiscal year.
Exactly. I think you pointed out, like even on, for example, on the paving, right? If we're assuming we're doing, X million of dollars per year, X many miles, if you will, per year, and we we see certain budgetary pressures, we could bring that down a little bit.
But I also
right?
think there's more discretionary spending that is easier to defer than maybe paving might be.
Sure, I was just using it as a.
Yeah.
Not
No,
going after
no,
paving, but,
exactly.
yeah.
Your road won't be paved.
Yeah.
So,
This is helpful.
I really was trying to say that because of what you pointed out, 3%, with the contracted services or labor, 4% overall because you add healthcare. Okay, well, there's gonna be times where we really do wanna grow something. You wanna buy Great Island, and I don't mean the purchase, but the ongoing expenses that it costs to maintain it, that the town wanted. And, that's a good thing, but it's more, it's because it's additional expenses. So I think it's just important to always go back, what can we do differently? Like, is there anything that we can do differently in some of these areas?
and that's why I think, like a core part of the annual budgeting process, and frankly, like to me, it's sort of like a full-time job throughout the year, is constantly looking for efficiencies. Is it insourcing? Is it outsourcing? Is it some type of shared service? Is it rethinking sort of how we deliver stuff? Is it, looking back at what we've maybe added 10 years ago, if there's a certain
Yeah.
program we're offering in town that where there's not really the take up, does it still make sense to do
Right.
it?
Can AI do it?
Can we do more, if we're gonna do more of X,
Right. So-
isn't there a way to do less of Y?
Yeah.
Right, to fund the more of X? Or maybe not, but that examination needs to occur.
Yeah.
Well, priorities change,
Yeah.
so then
Yeah.
things
Well,
that
the
you've been
whole town
doing
sh-
for,
yes.
Yeah.
things that you've been doing for a long time aren't as important anymore.
And technology,
Yes.
and all kinds of things, everything changes, right? Yes.
So a lot of this will work its way into the state of the town. A few more pages sort of around this, but this is generally, what we plan to share. Again, both like the numbers, kind of where we sit today, but also I think the strategy that we want, us as a town to be following.
So it's really helpful to have this conversation now.
Yeah.
So this was very informative.
Yep. And I think that, listen, this is a start to the conversation. I think the Board of Ed kind of kicks off their budget season, end of December, beginning of January. Board of Selectmen's 3 or 4 weeks behind that. And so I think the important thing is that we follow their budgets closely, and more communication is always better than less.
There's two things here. One of the things that concerns me is we shouldn't be aiming for a mill rate. That's not how I perceive things. Now, we're fortunate that as the grand list grows, even at the old mill rate, we're gonna have excess funds, which is basically what you were explaining with how certain things can be reduced. But I think Belinda's comment is, the real challenge is how to look at the various cores and the priorities and constantly have a view on how I shrink that while it's growing. Perfect example is the Board of Ed did that last year. One of the core projects is transportation. We would have wished it happened sooner, but the fact of the matter is that they took another look at a core product and figured out a better way to deliver it. And I think at times that's what we don't do as well
Right.
as we could. And I think that's what Malin was getting to. We can't just look at core and say, okay, this is what we did this year, this is what we're gonna do. In addition, one of the things that we've mentioned is every time you add something, we've just added some people to the police and public works, but also if a new program's coming up in the Board of Ed, not just what the cost is this year, but what's the 5-year cost of this program? So I've always used what you call it Mandarin Chinese, that we start with 6th grade, then we do 7th, 8th, 9th, and we're now doing Mandarin 16th or something when you're in the high school. But what's the assumed reduction in Spanish because you weren't doing that, which was part of it? And so those are the challenges here. I also think that we sometimes should be looking at, I know there was a decision that anything over $1 million will go and do bonding, but I kind of look with an $11 billion grand list. You know, if you have $1 million project this year, it's 10 basis points that we're adding to the mill rate, and it's over and done. And when you start looking, which I know you are doing, Jim, on a constant basis, it's not just what we have now, but we have Pear Tree Point. If we're looking at flooding, there's a way that you can assess the people that are benefiting from flooding now and have them pay like an assessment, not a tax, it's an assessment that we should look at. And we should be looking at those things on how we move forward on it. You know, we know that there's additional work to be done at Middlesex, and that's the things that we just don't want to keep on adding and kicking a can down the road, which I know you do.
Well, I think what I might
Okay.
suggest is, I think, have you guys had your organizational meetings?
Tomorrow,
Okay.
Monday.
So maybe once you, I think it'd be great, we can kind of have this conversation with F&B, once you guys
Yeah, we'd love
get
to.
there, and hopefully I'll have this other spreadsheet,
No,
the
I think
summary
it's a
done.
great
And
start, and I think it's great for what you're doing.
Yeah.
I just think that the complications, which is what Dan said and what Melinda said, is that it is a qualitative, not quantitative exercise. Because you're looking both short-term and what the effect is long-term. And quite honestly, you've done a great job on bonding to even that out. And I've mentioned that every time. But that's the challenges, because it's not unreasonable to expect the Board of Selectmen and the town, and the Board of Ed to be coming in with 5-6% budgets.
Well,
And
Jack-
just how sustainable that is.
let's set something up so we can maybe run through this with
Yeah,
with your
that was
committee,
just
and we'll
my
have the
first-
other stuff, and Jill, the offer's open if you and whether your finance committee or whatever want to have a conversation with some of us to kind of poke through some of these numbers in the spreadsheet and understand how we got here. You know, the invitation's open.
No, I think it's great work that you've done. I
Okay.
do want to compliment you on that.
Team effort. So next is going to be the financial report.
This is results through, or activity through October. Starting in the general fund, on the revenue side, our investment income is just under 1.4 million, which is about 42% of our budget. We've said it many times, we don't expect that rate of earnings to continue throughout the year. But for now, we're taking what we can get. We have about, we did about 50 million in T-bills. Most of those have matured because we're coming up to our next collection period. And so in January, the treasurer expects to put out about 50 million in T-bills again and have them mature throughout the course of the second half of the year. Town clerk's revenue, they had one significant $300,000 transaction. That's really bumped up their numbers, but overall they are going at a good clip. They've collected about 60% of their budget so far. So I think that one we've been a little nervous about as the real estate transactions started to, the volume of those started to drop off, but I think we're in good shape on that one. And then on building permits, we did include $500,000 in the budget for permit revenue for the redevelopment projects. Through October, we've received just over 24,000.
Is that something, like, does planning and zoning think that's just a timing issue? or
It's just
that's-
timing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just timing of when those projects are pulling their permits. There's not anything really of interest on the expenditure side for the general fund, which is pages 2 and 3. Everything's tracking as we expect. We do have some significant salary savings in the police department due to vacancies in patrol as well as dispatch.
How many total vacancies, do you know?
I know it's 3 dispatchers. I don't know how many officers. I want to say 3, but I'm not certain. On page 4, state revenues, about midway down on the top section, the MSRA sales tax sharing. We budgeted $75,000 because that one's been a bit of an unknown. We were getting nothing for a few years, and then one year I think we got about $200,000. I have to go back and check. I believe the state has said they will not be distributing anything in that program this year. It's only a $75,000 miss. We'll be able to make it up in other areas, but I think for next year, we might want to just budget zero in there. I think it's too much of an unknown. Page 5 goes over our contingencies. There's not much going on there. The administrative capital reserve reflects the replenishment that you approved last month. So we're up to $20,000 in that, but between that and your capital reserve, we're at about $183,000, and going into the budget, we'll be doing a round of capital closeouts. We didn't do that in the fall just because I didn't have time to pull that all together, but we will definitely be doing that before going into the budget, or as you're working through the budget process, I should say. The other funds are kind of as expected. We're in the collection period for the sewer fund. We went through the permit renewal period for the parking fund. Both of those performed as expected. The recreation program fund is performing as expected. I do want to call your attention to page 9 for the Great Island Management Fund. I went through all of the legal bills that have been paid, and about $70,000 that was related to tenants and leases and management side of stuff had been charged to the acquisition fund. So we reclassed that over to the management fund, which brought the fund balance down. We were originally saying it was around 240, 250. It's now down to 177. But that was the appropriate place for those expenses. Capital projects, our active bonded projects are moving along. We're seeing a lot more activity in HHR. Roughly from O&G, about $3 million between the three of them on a monthly basis with their monthly invoice. On page 14, the Great Island Acquisition Fund detail. It's not up at the top as of October 10th. It was as of November. I don't have the detail because Ed was away, so I don't have the backup that usually goes with this, but this is the other side to what I just mentioned in the Great Island Management Fund, where we see a decrease over the last month in legal of just under $78,000. The majority of that went to the Great Island Management Fund. A little bit of that went to the Great Island Development Fund because it was related to negotiating the contract for Reed Hildebrand and getting that up and running. And then the big one that we're keeping our eye on, beginning on page 15, is the ARPA grant. At the moment, we have just under $200,000 unobligated. $108,000 of that is in the sewer I&I fund because we haven't increased the PO on that because that's our in and out account. So we would be just constantly changing the PO amount, but before December 31st, we'll have our final amount and we'll increase that PO because the contract is more than what we will be appropriating.
And you
in
have the
ARPA.
authority to push up totally into there, right?
Yep, you guys gave me the
Yep.
administrative authority. So actually at the end, we've done one administrative transfer so far. The mobile generator came in a little bit over, $400 over, so I moved it out of the sewer I&I and over to the generator. So of that 196, 108 is for sewer I&I, which we know is obligated. We just haven't put it in as obligated yet. And 36,000 of that is for the Holohan backstop, and that bid is being opened tomorrow. So they'll be able to quickly award that. If for some reason there were no bids or it's not going to move forward, we'll just sweep it into the I&I account.
So is that true basically of everything? If on December 30th, we have some things that aren't obligated, we can sweep all of it into the I&I account,
Yep.
and this unobligated will be zero?
Yep.
Great,
That is the plan.
great.
The only other big one that's unobligated is the hose replacement. Really, DFD just has to place their order. It's on state bid, so it's very quick. They don't have to bid it or anything. They can just get that ordered.
And Jen, when it goes into because it's the sewer project, does that just reduce the expenditures out of the sewer fund?
Not out of the sewer fund. It'll reduce what we need to bond on the I&I project. We've done a couple of phases approved for bonding.
But doesn't that bonding get charged back to the sewer operating
Yeah, so
fund?
ultimately, it will reduce what the sewer fund has to,
So this will reduce
Reimburse
like
for
our
debt
sewer
service.
charges
Yep.
per se, it won't reduce our
it'll
taxes.
relieve some of that, yep.
Yep.
And that's all that I have on the financial report.
Okay. Minutes. We had October, our last regular minutes from October 15th, 2024. I had no comments. Other than mention, I did call the meeting to order at 7:30 PM, Paul, on time. Yep, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the Board of Finance for October 15, 2024. Millen moves, Paul seconds, all those in favor? Unanimous. Okay. Special assignments. I'll be very quick on Great Island. We had the second sort of community outreach meeting last Saturday. There were a couple hundred people there. They gave tours mainly of the facilities, so walking people around to kind of understand the condition of the various facilities as they begin to kind of think about what they might want to see out of those facilities or more broadly on the island. At the completion of that, we kicked off there's another survey that's out there, so if you guys haven't received it, you should definitely fill it out, give us your opinions on what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. And then lastly, on Saturday morning, the island, if you know, that was previously just opened, for the past year, really to residents only to kind of walk on the paths. Now residents have access to the whole island, with the exception of not going in the actual buildings and so forth. And then there are a handful of areas over there that Tony and Ed have kind of blocked off because they're either regrowing grass or doing some other work. So keep an eye out for the obvious stuff like construction tape and so forth. Otherwise, enjoy the island and fill out the survey and give us your feedback.
Including with dogs on leash, correct?
And you bring your dogs on leash and make sure you clean up after yourself. After your dog. Sorry,
Or
your
yourself.
dog, and any food you bring on. No, but really, I mean, I think it's an exciting time, and I think the feedback has been generally positive. I think people being able to kind of get on there and kind of walk all around and so forth. The biggest directional feedback that I've gotten is that people are just extremely happy to kind of be out on it, and aren't necessarily thinking as much about what's next. I think they're really sort of enjoying it. And it's
Question on the Darien Times article that said that the feedback on dog walking was close to 50-50, positive, negative. Is that accurate from your sense on being on the committee?
No, I think if you look at like the totality of the emails we received, I think, again, the input that we received was a lot more, I think, in favor of allowing residents kind of bring their dogs on. But again, a lot of that is the input we received. The first survey didn't really have any material questions around dogs other than like, who do you like to take to the island with you? But I think, what I would say is was a lot of discussion around that. I think what it prompted was more of a town-wide discussion. And I think John has said he's going to be looking at the issue more broadly, not just on Great Island, to see if we need to sort of tweak or fix or kind of clean up any of the provisions of the town charter that relate to being able to give somebody a fine if they're not on that. That said, I think everyone's intentions are to get the word out, educate people on keep your dog on a leash, please clean up after your dog. And I think that's the number one path that everyone wants to follow, but I think John's gonna sort of follow up on others just so that we have other things if they need to employ other routes. But you know, I've certainly seen a ton of people out there enjoying it, and so feedback there is good. And then, I guess, Jen, just, I'm on the audit committee, but any update on timing there?
I've reviewed a draft, gotten information back to them. We have one finding related to ARPA, because the reporting system, when I prepared it, I hit what I thought was just submitting it for Kate's review, but it actually submitted it, and she didn't review it before, so we got dinged for that we didn't follow their requirement to have somebody review it prior to submission.
Kate's fault.
It was totally mine. I was like, from last year, I think I do this part. No, I shouldn't have.
And just while we're on committee assignments, Jen, maybe if we could work to just sort of refresh all the different committees we have, who's on, since we've had some turnover, and we'll find some that, you know, that you guys would want to gravitate towards. So that's it. Dan or Paul, anything on pensions?
No.
Okay. Rob is not here. He's on vacation. I think Rob had reached out and was going to ask Chris Price and Jill McCammon to come and give us an update on what's going on with HHR. They're like over 25% done now, and things seem to be running very smoothly. And I think they were going to come to Board of Selectmen, give an update to Board of Finance and to the RTM. So I'll set aside maybe 20 minutes or so to get an update from them. But all seems to be pointed in the right direction.
If I might add, I spoke to Jill earlier. I know she's going to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, but things seem to be like a train on or close to schedule. So she may not be coming to the RTM until a little bit later down the road. But being that it's updates to both you and the Board of Selectmen, the RTM can easily just watch that.
Got it. Okay. So nothing new on the chairman's report. Any new business? As always, if you have stuff you want to see on the agenda, just email me or email Jen. And with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Jenny moves. Dan seconds. All those in favor? Stand adjourned. Thank you.